For 50 years, the red crane on the tail of Japan Airlines was not just a logo. It was a symbol of Japan's post-war miracle rising from the ashes. It was considered infallible, a flying government office that could never fail. But on the 19th of January 2010, the impossible happened. Japan Airlines was 2 trillion yen in debt. It was too bloated, too bureaucratic, and out of time. The company collapsed and filed for $25 billion in bankruptcy, leaving 15,000 jobs and the pride of a nation in the wreckage. It became the largest corporate failure in the nation's history. To fix the unfixable, Japan brought in a 77-year-old engineer and Buddhist monk out of retirement. He brought no spreadsheets, no fancy title, and no experience in the flying industry. And yet, in 2 years, he performed a miracle.
Welcome to the Discovery Clock series.
In the early 1950s, the skies over Japan were quiet. Under the Allied occupation following the Second World War, the nation was prohibited from operating its own aircraft. But as the country began to rebuild from the ashes, the government saw aviation not just as transport, but as a necessity for regaining national sovereignty. In August 1951, Japan Airlines was founded with a modest capital of 100 million yen. When the inaugural domestic flight took off in October, the reality of the post-war era was still visible in the cockpit. The aircrafts were leased mostly from Northwest Airlines, and because Japanese citizens were still banned from piloting, the captains were American. The government quickly realized that a private entity could not shoulder the burden of reconnecting Japan to the world. In 1953, the Japan Airlines Company law was passed. The government acquired a 50% stake in the venture. Japan Airlines ceased to be a private startup. It became a special company, a tokushu hojin. It became a direct extension of the state. This status granted Japan Airlines immense privileges. Under the Aviation Constitution, the 45/47 system, the airline was given a strict monopoly on international routes. Domestic competitors were kept small, while Japan Airlines was tasked with carrying the rising sun flag abroad. In the 1960s, as the economy began its miraculous ascent, the red crane became the ultimate symbol of Japanese prestige. It was a golden age for Japanese aviation. Japan Airlines represented the highest standard of omotenashi, or hospitality the country could offer. For the world, the airline was their first introduction to the new post-war Japan, efficient, polite, and rapidly modernizing. However, behind the glamour of international travel, a rigid culture was taking root inside the company. Because it was state-owned, Japan Airlines operated less like a competitive business and more like a government ministry. The executive ranks were filled through a practice known as amakudari, or descent from heaven. Retired bureaucrats from the Ministry of Transport were parachuted into high-ranking positions at the airline. They brought with them a culture of heavy regulation, strict hierarchy, and a focus on procedure rather than profit. This would have profound consequences on the company on the long run. Throughout the 1970s, the company ballooned in size. Unions became powerful and fragmented, often paralyzing decision-making. but the protected monopoly meant there was no real penalty for inefficiency. Ticket prices were set by the government, not the market, and as long as the Japanese economy kept growing, the airline remained comfortable. But across the Pacific, the winds were shifting in another direction. In 1978, the United States passed the Airline Deregulation Act. For the first time in history, US airlines were free to set their own fares and routes. Competition exploded. Fares prices dropped. The era of the protected national flag carrier was beginning to end. By the mid-1980s, the Japanese government recognized that the global aviation market was changing. The protective shell of the 45/47 system was becoming a liability. To survive in a deregulated world, Japan Airlines would need to become more agile. It would need to cut costs. It would need to be more privatized. The stage was beginning to set for privatization, but the transition from a government bureaucracy to a private enterprise would prove to be much more difficult than anyone had anticipated. The government could sell its shares from the company, but it could not easily sell off the culture governance it had created. In November 1987, the Japanese government officially sold its stake in Japan Airlines. The privatization was designed to grant Japan Airlines the freedom to operate more like a modern, competitive corporation, unburdened by the slow machinery of the Ministry of Transport. However, Japan Airlines entered the private sector at the precise moment the Japanese asset price bubble was reaching its peak. The country was awash in cheap capital. Corporations felt they could not fail. Instead of using its new freedom to trim costs and stabilize itself, Japan Airlines decided to spend more and build an empire. The corporate strategy shifted from aviation to a comprehensive lifestyle. Management believed they could improve every aspect of a passenger's journey, and not just during the flight. Japan Airlines borrowed heavily to expand into non-core businesses such as hotels, leisure resorts, notably in Hawaii, and golf courses. In the air, the strategy was equally aggressive. Whilst American and European competitors were beginning to look at more efficient ways to keep their airlines afloat, Japan Airlines prioritized capacity and prestige. They purchased more Boeing 747s than any other airline in history. The Jumbo became the symbol of Japan Airlines' dominance, but it was expensive to fly and harder to fill. When the economic bubble burst in the early 1990s, the foundation of their strategy evaporated. The value of the hotels and resorts collapsed, but the loans used to buy them remained. During the lost decade, Japan Airlines would be paralyzed by the weight of its own assets, managing debt rather than managing the airline. Privatization had also failed to change the internal culture. The company still retained the Amakudari system. Retired bureaucrats from the government ministries were given high-ranking positions within Japan Airlines. This ensured that the mindset of the company remained risk-averse and bureaucratic. They were private in name, but still government in spirit. This lack of clear leadership allowed internal divisions to fester. The workforce was fractured into 8 different labour unions. The pilots, cabin crew, and ground staff operated in silos. There was no single Japan Airlines, but rather a collection of warring factions protecting their own interests. By the late 1990s, the global aviation industry underwent another structural shift. Airlines in the United States and Europe began forming multilateral alliances: Star Alliance, One World, and SkyTeam. These networks allowed member airlines to share codes, routes, and frequent flyer programs, significantly lowering costs and expanding reach. Japan Airlines' domestic rival, All Nippon Airways, or ANA, was moving quickly. ANA joined the Star Alliance in 1999, instantly connecting its network to global partners such as United Airlines and Lufthansa. This allowed ANA to capture a larger share of international corporate traffic. Japan Airlines, however, hesitated. Relying on its historical dominance and size, they preferred to maintain their own independent bilateral partnerships. They did not fully join the One World Alliance until 2007, nearly a decade after the alliance system was established. This delay cost them valuable market share in the high-yield international sector. Instead of looking outward to global alliances, Japan Airlines was looking inward. In 2002, in an attempt to regain market share from its leaner rival, ANA, Japan Airlines executed a massive merger with Japan's third-largest carrier, Japan Air System. Ideally, this would have created a dominant supercarrier, but in reality, it had created logistical chaos. The merger mashed together two incompatible fleets: Japan Airlines' Boeing heavy lineup and Japan Air System's smaller Airbus fleet. This meant duplicate maintenance crews, duplicate spare parts, and duplicate training programs. Instead of streamlining, the organization became even more bloated. The cost structure of the new Japan Airlines was among the highest in the global industry. They were flying too many types of planes, with too many employees, carrying too much risks. By 2005, Japan Airlines had the revenue of a global giant, but the profit margins were razor thin. The company had spent nearly 20 years expanding, merging, and borrowing, assuming that their sheer size would protect them, that they were too big to fail. They were about to find out that size offers no protection against a storm. By the mid-2000s, the operational complexity of the merged airline began to manifest in safety issues. Between 2005 and 2006, a series of maintenance oversights and safety lapses occurred. While there were no fatal accidents, the Ministry of Transport issued a business improvement order to the airline. For a company whose brand was built on reliability, this public reprimand significantly damaged consumer trust. Simultaneously, the industry faced a challenging economic environment. The price of jet fuel began a steep ascent, eventually peaking at over $140 per barrel in 2008. Fuel represents one of an airline's largest operating expenses. For Japan Airlines, which possessed a fleet still heavily reliant on four-engine Boeing 747s and older MD-81s, this price spike was devastating. Competitors who had transitioned to newer twin-engine aircraft, such as the Boeing 777, were better insulated against these costs. Japan Airlines' fleet strategy, which had prioritized capacity over efficiency during the bubble era, now resulted in a cost per seat mile that was significantly higher than the industry standard. The tipping point arrived in September 2008. The collapse of Lehman Brothers triggered the global financial crisis. Demand for international air travel plummeted, particularly in the premium business sector, which generated the majority of Japan Airlines' profits. With high fixed costs and falling revenue, the airline began burning through its cash reserves at an alarming rate. However, in August 2009, a political shift occurred. The Democratic Party of Japan won a landslide election, ending decades of rule by the Liberal Democratic Party. The new administration took a harder look at the Japan Airlines crisis. They commissioned the task force to audit the airline's books, and their findings were stark. The task force concluded that Japan Airlines was effectively insolvent, with liabilities exceeding assets by over 800 billion yen. The company was losing approximately 1 billion yen per day. The task force determined that further loans would only delay the inevitable. The newly elected government realized that Japan Airlines could not survive without massive concessions from its lenders, even after receiving 3 bailouts from the previous administration during the past decade. Japan Airlines' main creditors, such as the state-owned Development Bank of Japan, along with the private megabanks Mizuho, Bank of Tokyo Mitsubishi UFJ, and Sumitomo Mitsui, were placed in a difficult position. In October 2009, in a desperate bid to clean up the balance sheet, financial institutions and other creditors were initially asked to forgive 250 billion yen of debt. However, the final figure would later climb to a staggering 730 billion yen. The banks alone were asked to forgive approximately 350 billion yen. It was a harsh compromise, but it averted total collapse of the company. The government was simultaneously facing geopolitical pressure. Upon seeing Japan Airlines financially weakened, foreign competitors began circling around it. Delta Airlines and American Airlines, with whom it had a partnership with in the One World Alliance, both offered financial aid in exchange for closer ties and influence over Japan Airlines' international network. In other words, they wanted to acquire the company for themselves. For the Japanese government, the prospect of their national flag carrier effectively coming under the control of an American company was unacceptable. Japan Airlines had to remain Japanese. The government was also haunted by the memory of October 2001, when Swissair sadly collapsed. The Swiss fleet was grounded abruptly worldwide due to a lack of cash for fuel, leaving thousands of passengers stranded, humiliating the nation and creating public outrage among the Swiss people who blamed the banks and their government for not intervening sooner to save the company. Japanese officials were determined to avoid a similar grounding at all costs. On the 19th of January 2010, Japan Airlines filed for bankruptcy protection under the Corporate Rehabilitation Law, a legal framework designed to help large companies restructure their debts while continuing operations. It was the largest non-financial corporate bankruptcy in Japanese history. The company carried a total debt of 2.3 trillion yen. The consequences were immediate. Japan Airlines' stock was delisted from the Tokyo Stock Exchange, rendering its shares worthless. However, to ensure planes kept flying during the restructuring of the company, the Enterprise Turnaround Initiative Corporation of Japan, or ETIC, a state-backed body, injected 350 billion yen of public funds and guaranteed credit line into Japan Airlines. The government had saved the airline from liquidation, but the path to recovery was still unclear. The old management team had resigned. To lead the restructuring, the government decided to make an unconventional choice. They did not choose an aviation expert, a banker, or a minister. Instead, they approached Kazuo Inamori, the 77-year-old founder of Kyocera and Buddhist priest, to save the national carrier, not with financial engineering, but with a new philosophy. Kazuo Inamori was born on the 30th of January 1932 in the southern city of Kagoshima, Kyushu region. He was the second eldest of 7 children in a family shaped by modest means. His father owned a printing shop where young Inamori first tinkered with machines, fueling his passion for science. Yet his early years carried a pivotal shadow. In the winter of 1944, and at the age of 12 he contracted tuberculosis, a disease that was often a death sentence at the time, and one that had already claimed the lives of his uncle and aunt. Confined to his bed, feverish and terrified, he began to read a book a neighbour had given him titled The Truth of Life by Masaharu Taniguchi, a Buddhist philosopher. One passage has struck him. What one envisions in the mind can manifest itself as a phenomenon in reality. It was his first lesson in the power of the human mind. He survived the illness, but the path forward was difficult. During the post-war chaos, he failed the entrance exams for the prestigious imperial universities, so he settled for Kagoshima University, where he studied applied chemistry. He was a brilliant student, but when he graduated in 1955, the economic situation of Japan was still in ruins. He eventually landed a job in Kyoto at Shofu Industries, a manufacturer of high-voltage insulators. It was a company in decline. The factory was dilapidated, wages were chronically late, and the union was in a perpetual state of strike. Most of his colleagues quit within months, but Inamori, having nowhere else to go, decided to stay. He spent so much time in the Shofu Industrial Laboratory that it became his second home. He poured his entire existence into his experiments and development work. Through this dedication, he managed to synthesize a new type of ceramic material. It was a technical breakthrough that saved the company from bankruptcy. However, a new engineering manager arrived in the company. He quickly dismissed Inamori's hard work and education by telling him, "This is as far as you can go with your background and skills. We'll take it from here. You can take a step back now." He realized he could not fulfill his dream as a top-tier engineer in a company that completely lacked an understanding of the human mind. Despite the company's efforts to reassign him to other roles and retain him, Kazuo Inamori eventually left Shofu Industries in December 1958. In 1959, at the age of 27, he went on to found his own company, Kyoto Ceramic, later known as Kyocera, thanks to the backing of 3 million yen from these benefactors. He had no money, but he had 7 colleagues who believed in him and decided to join his company. To bind them together, they signed a traditional blood oath, pledging to work not for profit or shareholders, but for one another. Inamori was not a typical CEO. He didn't care about pedigree or seniority. He cared more about the human relationship. He believed that human trust and conviction can reach a point at which there is nothing stronger, more constant, or more loyal than the human mind. Early on, the company, with just 28 employees, supplied high-frequency insulator components for television picture tubes to Matsushita, now Panasonic, and Sony in Japan, and silicon transistor headers and ceramic substrates to US leaders such as Fairchild Semiconductor, IBM and Intel, tying its growth directly to the emerging global electronics industry in Silicon Valley. A decade after its founding, in 1969, Kyocera established its first overseas unit in Sunnyvale, California, and later took over Fairchild's ceramic semiconductor packaging operations, becoming the first Japanese technology firm to manufacture in California. The company also appears in Apple's official supplier lists from the 2000s onward. But the ceramics industry was just the beginning. In 1984, as Japan opened its telecommunications market to competition through deregulation, Kazuo Inamori seized the opportunity to cut long-distance telephone prices and improve service for the Japanese people by founding Daini Denden Incorporated as a new common carrier to compete with the former state monopoly, Nippon Telegraph and Telephone. People laughed at the idea that a ceramics manufacturer could run a phone network, Inamori, however, argued that a management philosophy rooted in serving society and employees was more important than prior industry experience. Over time, DDI expanded through alliances and mergers, notably combining with KDD and IDO in 2000 to form KDDI Corporation, which went on to become Japan's second-largest telecommunications provider, offering fixed-line, mobile, and internet services nationwide. By the late 1990s, Kazuo Inamori was already a highly respected businessman. But his life took a dramatic turn after a diagnosis of stomach cancer, which forced him to confront his own mortality and deepened his lifelong spiritual reflection on how humans should live and work in this world. He gradually stepped back from day-to-day corporate management, transferring much of his economic stake by donating substantial Kyocera shareholdings to employees through internal schemes and to public interest causes, and devoted himself more fully to philanthropy, ethics education, and the Inamori Foundation's work on the Kyoto Prize and human betterment. At the age of 65, he underwent formal Buddhist training and was ordained as a monk in the Rinzai Zen tradition at Enpukuji Temple in Yawata, Kyoto. Kazuo Inamori did not disappear entirely into monastic life, but he did undergo rigorous Zen practice after ordination, including traditional mendicant rounds in which monks walk door to door in all weather to receive alms, an exercise meant to humble the self and weaken attachment to ego and material comfort. This experience reinforced his lifelong emphasis on altruism, which he framed as Rita, the principle that management and work should be oriented toward benefiting others, employees, customers, and society, rather than personal gain. He believed that learning to serve without expecting anything in return was essential both to spiritual growth and to creating an ethical corporate culture. Convinced that his active business career had quietly ended, he was nevertheless approached in early 2010 and, at the age of 77, by the Japanese government, who pleaded for him to lead the restructuring of the bankrupt Japan Airlines, then under court-managed rehabilitation after years of financial and cultural decay. Inamori accepted the role of chairman on 3 conditions. He would bring no team with him, he would accept absolutely no salary, and that he would be allowed to reform the company's underlying mindset, arguing that Japan Airlines' problems stemmed less from finance than from a loss of purpose, morale, and responsibility within the organization. Policymakers turned to him precisely because they believed that a conventional financial advisor could not cure those entrenched cultural corporate governance issues, whereas Inamori's focus on character, mission, and the human heart might restore both discipline and pride within the airline. On February 1st, 2010, Inamori-san arrived at Haneda Airport with a new vision in mind. When Kazuo Inamori arrived at Japan Airlines headquarters as new chairman, he encountered a split reality. The company was losing hundreds of millions of yen daily amid bankruptcy proceedings, yet the executive atmosphere remained eerily complacent, with many of the directors lacking a true sense of leadership and treating the situation as a temporary administrative issue rather than an existential threat. Inamori quickly exposed the core problem: a lack of real-time visibility into operations, where detailed profitability data for departments, routes, or flights took months to aggregate into cumbersome reports that reached the board far too late. Previously, there was no granular accountability. Losses from underperforming units were simply absorbed into a massive corporate budget, leaving the company effectively flying blind, without daily tracking or individual responsibility. To help fix these more technical problems, Kazuo Inamori would revive a proven strategy from his past: the amoeba management system. Originally developed at Kyocera in 1963 during the opening of its Shiga plant, he created it as a practical solution to Kyocera's scaling challenges when the firm grew beyond 100 employees and he could no longer micromanage every detail. To compare performance across varied operations, such as high-tech production at headquarters versus mass manufacturing at Shiga, Inamori paired amoebas, or small flexible teams modelled like a single-celled organism that could adapt and make decisions independently, with the hourly efficiency system, using added value metrics to equitably assess units and boost productivity, technology, and output. Inamori would introduce this amoeba management system at Japan Airlines, but its application would be more nuanced than simply turning every occupational group into an independent unit. He pushed decision-making and responsibility closer to the front line by reorganizing work into many small amoebas, each a team with its own leader, goals, and simple profit and loss accounting, rather than just a classic top-down hierarchy. Each amoeba was required to track its own daily revenues and expenses as if it were a tiny business. For example, when mechanics repaired a part instead of scrapping it, the cost savings showed up immediately in that team's figures, making the impact of their choices visible. This daily accounting discipline helped frontline employees, from maintenance and ground operations to cabin crews, see that their routine decisions directly influenced whether their unit created or destroyed value, encouraging them to think less like anonymous bureaucrats and more like responsible merchants running a customer-focused enterprise. However, Inamori understood that fixing Japan Airlines would require more than simple new accounting rules and organizational charts. The deeper task was to transform the company's cultural attitude and everyday standards of behavior. He therefore created and personally promoted the Japan Airlines philosophy, a compact red handbook derived from his Kyocera management principles, and made sure a copy went to each of the roughly 32,000 employees, from senior executives to frontline staff. The book set out short, almost elementary-sounding maxims such as be humble, work harder than anyone else, always do what is right as a human being, and the idea of aligning vectors so that everyone's efforts point in the same direction, along with reflections on responsibility, respect, and serving customers and society. Inamori backed this up with mandatory philosophy study sessions and open discussions, insisting that managers lead by example and that decisions be tested against these principles so that governance, daily operations, and individual conduct were all anchored in a shared ethical framework rather than just financial targets. Inamori also attacked the social and physical distance between management and staff by creating compass meetings, informal gatherings where executives were required to sit, eat, and drink with frontline employees rather than staying in exclusive corporate spaces. At these sessions, he and other leaders would literally walk among crews, pouring beer for flight attendants, mechanics, and cargo handlers, asking about their work and families, to listen directly to their concerns and ideas. The aim was to break down what many employees saw as a remote, bureaucratic, flying government office, and replace it with a more human, open culture where hierarchy softened and mutual respect could grow. However, the transformation demanded a heavy price. The restructuring plan, drafted with the Enterprise Turnaround Initiative Corporation, required a 30% reduction in personnel. Inamori faced the harsh demands of Japan Airlines restructuring head-on, overseeing the reduction of about 16,000 jobs through massive layoffs, voluntary retirements, and the sale of non-core subsidiaries. Though these cuts clashed painfully with his core belief that a company's true purpose is to foster happiness for its employees and broader society, he saw them as an unavoidable sacrifice to preserve the airline, protect the livelihoods of those who stayed, and prevent wider economic damage. Japan Airlines' fleet also had to undergo a rigorous rationalization under Inamori's oversight, with the retirement of around 110 older, inefficient aircraft, including the iconic but fuel-thirsty Boeing 747s, which symbolized the excesses of Japan's bubble economy era, and a shift toward a leaner mix of smaller, more fuel-efficient models such as the Boeing 787 Dreamliner and Airbus A350 for long-haul routes. The airline also stopped unprofitable routes, eliminating about 50 international and domestic lines that prioritized political prestige or low-demand prestige over actual passenger traffic and revenue potential, while redirecting capacity to high-yield markets. In spite of all that, the slow and painful restructuring of Japan Airlines was working. Stripped of its bloat and armed with real-time data, the amoebas began to generate profit for the company. The mindset had shifted from entitlement to teamwork, and by the end of the fiscal year in March 2011, just 1 year after its bankruptcy, the company didn't just break even. It posted an operating profit of 188 billion yen. The miracle revival of Japan Airlines had begun. In its place stood a lean, humble, and fiercely competitive company ready to return to the world stage. On September 19th, 2012, just 2 years and 8 months after filing for bankruptcy, Japan Airlines returned to the Tokyo Stock Exchange. It was the second largest IPO worldwide that year, surpassed only by Facebook. The company that experts had previously stated it was unsinkable, then unfixable, had not only survived, but it had become one of the most profitable airline in the world. However, the speed of this recovery drew sharp criticism from the competition. All Nippon Airways, or ANA, Japan Airlines' main domestic and international rival, publicly protested the relisting. They argued that the playing field had been tilted. Because of the bankruptcy proceedings, Japan Airlines had benefited from a massive corporate tax exemption on its new profits, a waiver worth hundreds of billions of yen. ANA claimed that Japan Airlines was essentially a state-sponsored entity, using public funds and tax breaks to undercut the market. It was a valid grievance. But for the government, the priority had been the national symbol's survival over fair competition. The Japan Airlines miracle was a genuine one, but it was undoubtedly fueled by a clean financial slate that its rivals did not possess. With the financial house in order, Inamori had achieved everything he could for the company and was preparing to leave. But he left behind one final gift. For decades, Japan Airlines had been led by administrative bureaucrats. Inamori broke this tradition by appointing Yoshiharu Ueki as the new president, who happened to be a lifelong pilot within the company. For the first time in its history, the airline would be led by an aviator, someone who understood the sky and not just the spreadsheet. In 2013, having fulfilled his promise to the Prime Minister, Kazuo Inamori stepped down from the board. He accepted no payment for his 3 years of service. He took no stock options. He simply bowed, thanked the employees for their hard work, and returned to his quiet life in Kyoto. The company enjoyed 7 years of stability and prosperity, unaware that the greatest challenge to global travel was just over the horizon. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic brought global aviation to a halt. But this time, Japan Airlines did not require a government bailout. True to Inamori's teachings of dam management, always keeping a reservoir of resources for a drought, the company had built up massive cash reserves during the good years. The amoebas quickly adapted to the new reality, without waiting for top-down orders. Kazuo Inamori had taught the company how to survive a storm, ensuring that the sun would rise again for the red crane. But sadly, even the brightest guiding lights cannot burn forever. On the 24th of August 2022, and at the age of 90, Kazuo Inamori quietly passed away in his home in Kyoto. He left behind a legacy that transcended ceramics and telecommunications. He showed the world that the numbers on a balance sheet are merely a reflection of the spirit of the workforce. He taught a nation that even when the sun sets on an era of excess, it can rise again, provided you have the humility to learn and the courage to change. Without an honest heart that allows us to admit our mistakes and learn from them, there can be no human progress.
で今までですね全部穴に乗っとったと濡れたしおりをですね顔にぶつけてバカの前まとやったこともあります。
Hello everyone, thank you for watching the video and for your patience and support. Please consider subscribing and sharing the video, and as always, see you in the next one.